Okay, good evening, afternoon, morning, everyone. On behalf of the Local Public Sector Alliance, I'm Rachana Shrestha, one of the co-chairs of the Asia Expert Group that we have, and I would like to welcome you all and thank you so much for participating to our fourth Asia Expert Group meeting. For your information, for those of you who do not already know what Local Public Sector Alliance is, it is a global professional network that promotes inclusive governance and localized development around the world. And this alliance is inspired by the diversity and depth of experience and expertise of its global membership. I understand that we now have about 1,600 members from around the globe. And the alliance is organized in a decentralized manner with a small global secretariat, but led by a number of regional and thematic expert working groups. The Asia group is one of the regional groups and is co-chaired by Madhavi Rajadaksha. She is from the Oxford Policy Management. Then we have Peter Yates from the Asia Foundation and myself. And we have Professor Jamie Boex. He is the Executive Director of the Local Public Sector Alliance. And we have Lima. She's the coordinator. We also have Mirna Dev. She helps us with all the media work, communication, etc. And we also have Nick Travis and helping us with particularly on the Logica, which he will update us later today. This is our fourth meeting, actually, since we formed this team last year in 2023. We had our first meeting also in January last year, so this is our fourth meeting. We have been focusing on different thematic areas on decentralization and local governance. For example, our previous event focused on G20 India presidency, where we discussed urban governance and finance, urban planning, etc. And our discussion today will focus on climate change, particularly at the local level. So we have Rafael Moser. She is a program specialist from United Nations Capital Fund, UNCDF, based in Bangkok office, the regional office. And he will share with us his insights on advancing local climate action for sustainable communities in relation to this local climate adaptive living facility, shortly LOCAL program, UNCDF's LOCAL program, which he has been managing in many countries. UNCDF has this program in many countries and it's quite impressive. So this is also vis-a-vis his learning from COP28. So he participated in COP28, and there was this local program being featured also in the COP28. So we are very keen to hear from him about his experience and insight into how COP28 and UNCDF's this local, which is basically the local, as I mentioned, it's local climate adaptive living facilities. So we are very keen to hear from him on this. So our program today we also have a discussant from Oxford Policy Management. Her name is Sivaranjani Venkataramani. She's an economist and climate finance expert at Oxford Policy Management, and she will be the discussant on the presentation. Then we will have open floor discussions and an update on the state of local governance institutions in Asia by Nick Travis. But before that, and after me, we actually have a regional development issues update. We have this update in all of our event. This is our standard our context setting agenda. We basically bring different experts to speakers to give us a quick update on the regional development issues. And today we have Philip Gonzalez. He's a senior director of Indo-Pacific Forum of Federations. It must be quite early for him in Canada, and very grateful that he still, agreed to give us this update at this hour. So after me, we will have Philip Gonzalez giving us the regional development issues. Then we'll hear from Rafael Moser. He will be presenting on COP20. As I mentioned earlier, on the local climate and COP28. So without much ado, I would like to hand over to Philip Gonzalez, and he will share with us the regional development issues. Over to you, Philip.
Rachna, I don't think he's online right now.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. So in that case, then we can move on to Rafael, because when Philip joins later, we can still get the regional update. So no problem. So over to you, Rafael.
Thank you so much, Rachana, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for the invitation to share some of the insights from COP, and also to share how UNCDF expects to address some of the challenges and the outcomes of COP. So let me just see whether I can share my screen. Can you see my screen, the presentation here? I think it's coming, right?
Yes, Rafael, we can see.
Okay, that's great. It's just a bit slow on my side, I guess. Great. So yeah, so thank you so much. So as Rachana said, I mean, COP28 was, as you may have heard, happened last year in December in Dubai. It was actually my fifth COP that I attended. And the one that I have attended so far, it was actually the biggest one. So I was really impressed by the size of the COP, and also by the level of engagement that I observed there, especially from, non-government institutions like civil society organizations, but also private sector was massively present there. And I've also heard that delegations with 3,000 people, which was a first for COP meetings. But of course, so there are so in terms of the negotiations, in the actual outcomes of the negotiations at COP, I highlighted some of the key issues that I observed that would somehow speak to that would make sense for this work around increasing local climate action. This is an area of expertise that UNCDF has been working for the past 12 years. So that I would like to highlight. So the first one, it was the first time that the COP has actually approved a loss and damage fund with pledges that somehow amounted to $700 million. And I think this is a very important step, because as we have also seen from the latest IPCC reports, every increment in temperature, has a difference in terms of the impacts on systems, people, and also nature systems. And also recognition that there will be cases where adaptation per se will not be enough, and that means that we will need to somehow have mechanism and financial means or support to actually address those losses and damages, particularly for the countries which are considered the most vulnerable to climate change. And here I'm talking about the small island developing states, across the Pacific, Caribbean, others across Africa, but also what we call the lower income countries, or the least developed countries, as it is classified by the UN, which are countries with the least capacity to actually address climate change issues. So this fund will be extremely important. Of course, the 700 million is just a beginning. And it's not enough, and so some figures say it's only about 0.2% of that covers the needs of only 0.2%. But of course, it is somehow a milestone that we do expect to see increase and further discussions further down the line. And this fund will be managed by the World Bank basically for years, if I'm not mistaken. So this is one of the key takeaways that I can mention here. The second one is of course, the global stocktake. So at COP28 was the first time that the country actually took stock of what has been done so far under the Paris Agreement, because without knowing the progress so far, it becomes really tricky to understand, what progress or what more ambition needs to be, taken forward in order for us to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. As you may recall, the key goals of the Paris Agreement is really to limit global temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius, but of course with the goal of the aim of keeping it at actually to 1.5%. And and there are some concerns that whether the world will actually achieve those goals, but somehow there was a reestablishment of that commitment, which still becomes alive and in the Paris Agreement, in really to make sure that we still keep to this goal, 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius goal. And the first global stocktake that was approved in Dubai actually recognizes that we are not on track. So it was the first time that countries really and explicitly recognize that we are off track. And this is especially important for adaptation, so we are not meeting the adaptation targets, also in terms of finance. Also, we know that, the adaptation finance only covers it's only 1/3 of all climate finance, dispersed from developed countries to developing countries. So we are far, behind in terms of, achieving the targets that we really need to really, address adaptation, especially overall. And also another important aspect of this global stocktake is also that it refers a lot to the local level in its document. It is really recognized as a level that needs to be taken into account if we are really to address, or to achieve the goals on the Paris Agreement. And this is especially important for the work around, digitalization, local public governance, because as we know, especially for adaptation in those least developed countries, adaptation is quite local, whereas mitigation, may seem important for these countries. Adaptation is a must. So, and when we have a document that really recognizes that we are off track, and that we need, course correction if we are to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, that's, provides us a very strong, let's say, call for action, that we need really to step up efforts to increase ambition on climate action. Another aspect, and that I would like to highlight here, is the fact that, it was the first time that the world approved a global goal on adaptation. It was actually not a goal per se, because as you may imagine, differently from mitigation, adaptation, where you have a metric, if we cut down on, or reduce CO2 emissions, somehow we have a target, a common target for all mitigation efforts. For adaptation, it's quite contextualized. So we don't have a single metrics for adaptation. And there was an agreement back in Glasgow 2 years ago in 2021 that, the world approved the framework that would then establish the global goal on adaptation. That was finally approved in Dubai last year. And while somehow there were several, criticism around, this global goal on adaptation, because it really doesn't give us, specific indicators for sectors, for instance, for forest sector or water, but it does provide the world with a framework through which now we can then, establish, mechanisms that will then allow us to further break down on specific indicators in what they call themes. It's being broken down in themes, like, which could be interpreted as sectors. And also the local level here is considered as a cross-cutting theme that, cuts across several themes like, agriculture, water, health, which have also been identified as key sectors in terms of, adaptation. Of course, food systems here, which, involves, not only agriculture, but also water and other sectors there. So I think, it's an important framework that really provides us the starting point for now to be further developed into specific indicators that will be then taken at this sector level. So that was another, let's say, important milestone, I would say, from COP28. Of course, in terms of support, which also includes finance, as I mentioned, there was the recognition somehow that we are far behind meeting the financial needs that country needs to address adaptation, and it's only 1/3 of the finance which is now targeting adaptation. But on the other hand, we saw commitments and pledges from countries, especially on the adaptation fund, to really top it up for adaptation. So which is something good in terms of stepping up pledges for adaptation finance that is expected to increase. Also taking into consideration the agreement that was reached in previous COPs of the doubling of the adaptation finance. Now, let's say the latest available data that we have indicates that all adaptation finance from developed countries to developing countries stood at around $20 billion, and the agreement was to reach at least a doubling of that amount. But of course, we are far behind that target, and somehow there was a recognition of the need to step up efforts around more adaptation finance. And also on the adaptation fund, I think on this issue of the locally led adaptation track, which is also becoming an important aspect, is several I wouldn't say negotiations, but I think it's becoming part of the narrative of several partners and institutions that are really recognizing the importance of locally led action, especially for adaptation. And the Adaptation Fund, gathered some key partners to really discuss how the fund can have a dedicated window for locally led adaptation action. So the idea would be to have a dedicated financing window to fund locally led adaptation, and has been somehow somehow solidified, I think, at COP 28 as a key and important now aspect of the talks and the narrative around adaptation, that we cannot talk about adaptation without recognize the importance of local level actors. And somehow was as a recognition, or somehow an attempt to address somehow these important issues that the UN Capital Development Fund, which is a sort of capital grants, a branch of the UN that they developed some 12 years ago, and somehow it's still important and relevant for this kind of findings and outcomes from COP28, that we designed the local climate adaptability facility as a way to really address the adaptation finance gap that exists in extending adaptation action at the local level, particularly in the most climate vulnerable countries that I mentioned before, so the FECs, the small island states, and somehow they have a dedicated, let's say, window for addressing those issues. I'm just going to jump straight here. So, and just to show you how UNCDF aims at responding to those challenges, and also to ensure that we speak also to these outcomes of COP28. So as I said, Localis is a mechanism for financing locally led adaptation that really enables local authorities and also their communities in really making or be a specific actor in addressing or in implementation of the Paris Agreement. Because as we know, most of the discussions around the Paris Agreement, the national determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, I mean, by their names, they are pretty much national. But we know that adaptation is local, needs to be contextualized. So we need to have a mechanism, a platform through which those local level actors can, have a say and become champions in actually addressing, climate change, building or based on their own needs, not on needs which are somehow pre-established at the national level. And this is the whole principle, the core of Localis, really to provide, this mechanism to help local governments and their communities to effectively access climate finance at the local level. But it also, in addition to this funding or financial component, Localis also aims to provide capacity building and technical assistance to local governments and their communities so that they can become better in planning for adaptation, in executing adaptation investments, and also in monitoring those investments. So there is also this, let's say, objective of promoting the integration of climate change concerns in local government planning and budget systems, at the same time ensuring participation of communities, ensuring a gender responsive approach at the local level. And we use as a financial tool, an instrument that UNCDF has been using for the past 30 years, which is the performance-based grants, which has been somehow adjusted to include, climate change issues in those tools that really ensures, that verification and programming of local adaptation expenditures. Here, just briefly, just to show how this mechanism works in practice. So the whole idea here, and somehow also speaks to the work that the discussion that you have here under this platform, because it goes hand in hand with the centralization efforts. Localis is designed to be aligned with the existing intergovernmental fiscal transfer systems which already exist in the country. And so the idea here is to establish a national mechanism through which national governments will then channel climate finance, using different sources of finance. I'm talking about vertical funds like the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, but also bilateral donors, support from developed countries, but also using their own resources. And the idea is to channel these funds using the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system, so not creating any parallel systems, so that local governments will then access this additional top-up on top of their regular capital grant allocation, so they can cover the incremental cost of adaptation. So it's incremental to the regular capital grant already being received by those local governments. And the idea is really to use, performance-based grants, which basically means that in order for these local governments to access these grants, they will need to comply with a series of, indicators of performance, fiduciary standards, so that they can access those grants. And every year there is a sort of independent evaluation or annual performance assessment, as we call it, that is going to look at how well each local government receiving those grants are performing along those indicators. And depending on the results that we get out of this annual performance assessment, the subsequent allocations will then vary accordingly. And by doing that, we somehow promote a competition, or we stimulate, improvements in performance along those indicators, which also target, of course, adaptation indicators, participation of, communities or vulnerable groups in planning processes at the local level, but also in monitoring at the local level, and so on. And also, we also target, of course, gender-related aspects there. And the idea is to somehow promote this, positive competition among, participating local governments, so they can become better in adaptation planning, managing, and monitoring. At the same time, by doing this annual exercise, we can also see areas which are somehow not doing so well, so we can adapt and customize the capacity building support, which will be then given to those, local governments in the next financial cycle. And of course, there is, capacity building, technical assistance that is happening, along the way, in terms of, understanding climate risks, because as we know, differently from, the classic business as usual or development, planning, adaptation planning requires understanding climate risks. And we cannot, talk about adaptation planning without actually downscaling those climate risks to the local level, so that, that information can be then, be taken into account in those local development plans and then adaptation plans. So, and in terms of, activities or sectors that, can be funded under this mechanism, here are just some of the, the key sectors that we usually see in the local countries. Of course, and this has been also highlighted by the Global Bond Adaptation, as the key sectors are water, agriculture, food systems, but also climate-proofing infrastructure is a key sector there. Sanitation, health is also another key sector. But the actual adaptation investment will really be decided by the local governments in consultation with their communities, and of course, taking into account, climate risk assessments that will need to be looked at. But we do provide a sort of boundary as to, where they can go or how far they can go, because of course it's a climate change mechanism. It needs to be aligned with the nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, and somehow this also speaks to the, the fact that, the global stocktake has highlighted the lack of data that exists in terms of, local level climate action. And this can also be used, local can also be used to actually collect data from the local level and to be aggregated at the national level, because we use an M&E system called Adaptation to Climate Change Adaptation Framework, ACAF, for simple, where, through this framework, which also starts with, understanding climate risks and somehow including taking stock of those risks and including those or integrating them in the local development plans, and of course coming up with adaptation outcomes indicators, adaptation output indicators. So we can use this framework to actually understand or evidence-based the adaptation rationale of each investment that is funded under this mechanism. And this can be used by the national governments in alignment with the adaptation priorities in those NAPs and NDCs, to really make sure that this can be a report back and also contribute towards the achievement of the goals which are set up at the national level. So just quickly here, the countries which are engaged in local globally, there are 38 countries globally which are using this methodology or this mechanism to fund adaptation to climate change at the local level. In Asia Pacific, there are 10, but of course in several states of implementation. What is important here to understand is that Local is not a project. As I said, it's designed to be aligned with the existing systems in the country. It is a country-based mechanism. And for that, it requires, a longer term implementation. So it started with a design phase and then moving to a phase 1 or a pilot phase where you're going to test out this mechanism in a few local governments in the country until we reach, phase 2, where this mechanism will then be scaled up to additional local governments in the country until it reaches phase 3, which are those countries that we see here in red in Asia. Bhutan and Cambodia are the countries, and Mozambique are the countries that have reached phase 3, where we expect a national rollout of this mechanism to as many local governments as possible in those countries. And at that point, the system is institutionalized. It is aligned with the decentralization, structures in the country. It is also a way for countries to deepen even further, these decentralization systems in the country, because as I said, it goes hand in hand with those decentralization efforts in the country. So also speaking to the outcomes of the COP28 in terms of direct access to climate finance, just also to mention that Local also support countries direct access to vertical funds or to climate finance, in particular the GCF and Adaptation Fund. And so far, the current portfolio includes around 180 million US dollars in terms of projects which have been or are in the process of being submitted to the GCF Adaptation Fund. And somehow this also speaks to the need to ensure further direct access instead of having mediation through international or regional intermediaries, so that countries can get the most out of those finance down to the community level where it's really needed. Also linked to the COP28 outcomes, I also would like to highlight this Article 6, or specifically 6.8 of the Paris Agreement, which deals with no market approaches. No market approaches, as the name suggests, are everything that has nothing to do with what is being put as in the market under the Paris Agreement. So there has been, a framework, a committee that has been set up in Glasgow to actually understand what no market approaches are. And Local has been referenced as one of possible and potential no market approaches that can be, used under the Paris Agreement to stimulate or to encourage or to promote more climate action among parties. And this has been further consolidated in Dubai, and it's still there. So there has been several supports from the countries which are implementing Local, so that Local can be further referenced in those as a potential market approach under the Paris Agreement. So I think I'll stop there because I'm not sure how much time I have left, but in case. So I have time. I could also bring some specific examples from countries in the region. But I'll stop there because I know it's a lot of information also to process, and also happy to address specific questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael. Yes, it's very useful and it's always nice to hear these good examples. I still remember how I enjoyed listening to these examples from different countries and in Korea. Anyway, we can look into this if the time allows, and maybe we can now call Siva for a discussion to this presentation. So Siva, over to you.
Thanks, Rachana, Lima, and Rafael. Could you let me know if I'm audible enough?
Yes, you are, Siva, very clear. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me on this session and taking us through this very interesting UNCDF example of the performance-based climate resilience grants. I had the opportunity to interact very closely with implementers of phase 3. At that time, phase 2 was closing in Cambodia, Rafael. So it's actually good to see that last slide of the map and the geographic spread of the intervention as of now, or rather the alignment process. You told us that it's not a program, more an alignment process. If time would permit, I'd like to just probably sort out my thoughts in 3 portions. The first one is just to share a couple of observations from the COP28 perspective, very informally, because you heard the headline messages from Rafael. And without repeating those, I'd like to add that there have been different different perspectives and views emerging at the COP that all sort of lead to a very common thread of, locally led climate action taking center stage. And as a bit of a trivia, COP28 was also the first COP when a dedicated day, a thematic day was dedicated to relief, recovery, and peace, where I think the community understands that development funding, humanitarian assistance, climate adaptation, loss and damage, these are channels of funding that cannot be looked at in isolation of one another any longer. And that has also, with COP28, included health-related, health emergency funding, as well as very well-articulated health climate plans. So it's important to understand locally led adaptation in the context of the broad strokes of these declarations which have emerged, and which are all sort of pointing to a very similar direction. That's something I just wanted to share. And the other part which I kept hearing echoing across the corridors of the event in Dubai was the need to collaborate and partner across the board. And just to give a very first-hand example, I just happened to drop by into a session on locally led adaptation in a certain country context, and I realized that I was part of the same country's intervention in locally led adaptation, and yet I had no clue that there was a parallel initiative of this kind. So this must be the case in a lot of, a lot of you might have very similar experiences of discovering other partners or potential players in the same fray and not knowing much about each other. So events such as these, just as a case in point, is very important, because that kind of exchange at every level is important to understand the landscape of other stakeholders who are peers in a sense, as well as to understand where exactly the frontier investigations need to be done at a local level, which is very dynamic. It's very geographically dispersed. But I think Rafael will also be able to share, if time permits, or even later, for those of you who are interested, to see the common threads across the geographies where he's mentioned phases in three phases, and then those which are at the design stage. So just as setting that context, moving on to the second set of thoughts that I was able to gather listening to Rafael. It's worthwhile mentioning or highlighting a part of his description of the local mechanism, where he mentioned that the whole idea is not to create a parallel set of systems, rules, or institutions, and that as practitioners and implementers, technical assistance providers to government, public institutions, and non-state actors, I think a lot of us share that sentiment, and we've also had that experience. It is very well evidenced as well that it's important to go with the flow and not try to always swim against the tide in this context. And so it's important that whatever set of mechanisms that we try to evolve and try to replicate, scale up, are very much in line with what is implementable in the local context. Sometimes we, up to a certain point of time, we kept saying country context, but now we're supposed to say local context, because it's going to vary very largely. That's a very notable point. Another part that I want to highlight, coming from the climate finance space, is this aspect of the local mechanism, which is trying to make this a very annual and regular exercise. What does that really mean from the local government's perspective and the local network perspective is that it provides a certain amount of stability in financial support for identified interventions or priorities at the local level, because that predictability of funding is what is often an issue when it comes to sustaining initiatives or setting a very relevant and a very important scale of ambition. So if there is capacity building, if there is infrastructure that's being built up at the local level in a climate resilient and risk-informed manner, then it's important to look at it automatically in a multi-year framework or in a dynamic horizon. And by being made part of the grants mechanism or the devolution logic from, say, the federal to the local level on an annual basis, it does support that the confidence in local governments to invest and to further build up from there. So that's another striking and a very important point. It may have been a little bit in the subtext of most of the work that we do, but I wanted to just share these two as very striking. Of course, there are other facets as well. The third set of points I thought I would pose mostly as questions, or a point where I would like to invite Rafael to respond first before probably we open up to further discussion. One was about, again, these relate to the local mechanism, the risk-informed investment menu, which you mentioned, and that would vary country to country. It would be interesting to know a little bit more about what typically goes into formulating that menu. For example, did UNCDF have a sort of a typical list from which you branch off geography-wise or local government-wise? Is there some guidance around that you provide so that the local government can then evolve its own list? If you could shed some light around that. I have totally three such points. So, Rafael, would you like me to go one after the other, or shall I just share all three and then you could respond?
Yeah, maybe you share the three of them and then I can address at once.
Okay, great. So the first one was around the risk-informed investment menu. I'll tell you why I raised this as a question. It's because of the data challenges at the local level and challenges in relevant scale of that data. Mostly, you have a lot of information, of course, but then information that is material enough to inform, say, funding decisions, right? So that's why I'm raising this point. It will be good to understand how experience has been. It could be a very evolving, discussion as well. It's okay. It'll be interesting to hear a bit more. The second one is on is sort of a feedback. How does the local mechanism itself support a local government, improve the quality of data or data systems? There must be some, you mentioned about the M&E that has to be followed, the framework. So if you could share an example of how it actually feeds back into the system such that the local government can then have a better way of collecting data or storing or improving the quality of data that it is already routinely collecting. So something around that as a feedback mechanism. And third is, again, coming back to being a climate finance person, do you have any examples within the UNCDF, within the local geographic span of, where a local government had this PBCRG and then being inspired by this mechanism, then stepped out, making a foray into accessing or considering, exploring non-grant instruments? So has it capacitated them to think about, defining what is climate resilient funding and then move out of just only relying on devolved funds, a part of which is determined in a performance-based manner or through the local mechanism, and then taking that and running further into the market or creating a more conducive environment such that it has greater credibility to access other types of instruments. So I'll probably leave it there, but thanks for the very informative description of where local is. I know time doesn't do justice to the expanse of the initiative. Over to you, Rafael.
No, thank you so much for the observations. I think they were quite accurate and I would agree with all of them, and also for the question. So maybe just to respond to your first question on the menu, this is a quite important aspect. The menu is designed to provide a boundary at the design level, right? So we have like the design document of a locale in a specific country, and then you have this investment menu, which provides, somehow a guidance. It's not, prescriptive. It should be only like indicative of the sectors that could be considered for funding. And they need to be aligned, first of all, with the NDCs, the adaptation priorities in the NDCs. We know that no NDC is not the most appropriate place for, shared adaptation, but we know that some countries, because of, they were late in developing their national adaptation plans, they started putting adaptation priorities in the NDC. So we have used, especially in the past, NDCs, and of course, national climate change documents, which specify adaptation sectors there. So, and then of course, more and more, we have to start using the NAPs, the NAP documents, the National Adaptation Plan, also as a key document for understanding what are the key sectors that could enter that. But of course, we also need to understand, and this will vary in each country, what areas, local government in those specific countries can actually act upon. Because there will be cases where, local governments have no mandate to operate in specific sectors. So if that's the case, those sectors, will not be featuring there. But typically, we usually see, agriculture, land use or climate-proof infrastructure. Water is health. I mean, these are all sectors which usually, local governments in most countries, they have mandate to act on. And our portfolio is mostly concentrated, I would say, maybe 80% around these, sectors: agriculture, water, and and then the infrastructure, because it's still like, coming from this, kind of capital grant world, industrialization, there's it's heavy on infrastructure still, even though we try to make sure that, we also move a little bit away from that. But then this is at the, let's say, invest menu level. But then, of course, when it comes to the time where the local government needs to understand or to decide, what adaptation investment will be funded, this needs to happen or needs to be refined using the framework that I showed briefly, the ACAF, which is basically made of building blocks. We started from understanding climate risks. Usually, of course, not all countries we were able to do that, but ideally we would support the country in developing a climate risk assessment report, which starts with them scaling, regional or national level models to as low as possible. In some cases, we were able to get to a resolution of 5 kilometers. So to really allow a very precise way for local governments to actually plan in those specific localities. So that would be the ideal scenario, but of course it's not possible in all countries. So it really varies in each country, but ideally would be localization of those or downscaling of those models that can then be used to refine the adaptation investments. And then, of course, we need to understand actually the adaptation rationale. So as part of this ACAF framework, it is the second step would be then to come up with, okay, so I have identified this climate risk specific from my locality. So what are the possible activities that will address those risks? And then out of a list of 5, let's say possible adaptation measures addressing those risks, they will need to come up with maybe 2, because the funds are also limited, so they cannot fund all of those 5. So they will come up with maybe 2 adaptation or the key adaptation interventions that will then be put for funding. And of course, they need to follow their own procedures for approval. Usually requires consultation with communities. And they are going to be also assessed in terms of gender responsiveness of those adaptation investments. And they also need to come up with adaptation outcomes and adaptation inputs that will be then used. And perhaps this links to your question on the data. So this is also part of the support which is given to the local governments, understanding or coming up with those adaptation outcome indicators, output indicators, and also what we call the local information system of adaptation, which is a sort of follow-up of the climate risk informed or investment menu, and also this climate risk assessment report, which is a system, usually is a platform, web-based platform, where all this data is then fed into that platform, which ideally should be be updated regularly in terms of how vulnerability will change, how specific sectors will then change, considering if there is any change in terms of the adaptive capacities of those local governments. But the idea would be to provide support around those those tools so they can become better and better in adaptation planning. And of course, these performance-based grants, they are divided into 2 groups. One group is the minimal conditions of access, as we call them, and these are mandatory indicators. The other half are performance measures, which somehow they do not disclassify access to those grants, but they provide additional points. So the more they will get better in data management, the more they will get in the subsequent year. And then in the maybe perhaps the last question, because I know that we are running out of time, in terms of non-grants activity, I mean, we have the case of Cambodia, which actually took a loan from IFED to channel through that system. It's not the usual, I would say, preference of, especially for the the LDCs, because as we know, the whole narrative and ask of those countries is really for more grants for adaptation, because they don't want to pay for the cost of adaptation. But of course, some have recognized that they're not going to achieve what they need only with grants, and they have started taking action towards non-grant, like the case of Cambodia in that case. Or even using their own resources at times. Like, we have cases, I mean, budget support was on from Bhutan in the region. I mean, Solomon Islands, is now using also own resources in that system. So it will vary in each country, but, let's say the usual scenario is still grant based, but we see a trend towards, more non-grant based. Also recognize, that, grants will not be enough to address adaptation needs.
Thanks, Rafael. A very quick follow-up question, and then we could hand back to Rachna and the floor. On the last point that you made, either through the local mechanism or in other agenda of the UNCDF, do you also enable capacity building or basically enable access to non-grant instruments? Is that something that is part of your agenda?
Yeah, no, we do provide support around non-grant mechanism. I mean, we have cases from not in Asia, I would say, but in Africa, in the Gambia and Ghana specifically, where we had a component as part of a major program, country-based program, where we had work with private sector, develop SMEs mostly, where we launched call for proposals, and then we have this dual key system, as we call it, where on the one hand, we look at the financial sustainability and viability of the proposals, the project proposals. On the other hand, we also look at the climate additionality. So we have like two streams of work, financial and thematic, in this case, climate relevance of those investments. And this, we received, in the case of the Gambia, 40 applications. Out of those 40, we could only afford to provide support for 6. Including grant support, but the idea would be to provide support for project structuring. So those, projects could become, better viable from a financial perspective. And then using a seed capital grant, usually was $100,000. They could go to the financial market and somehow get lower interest rates. And with that, somehow complementing a sort of blended finance scheme, the whole, and be able to somehow complement, the investment portfolio in that sense. So it was one of, something that we piloted. It has not been scaled up to other countries yet, but it is a model that we have, been piloting, and I think it's going to become more and more, especially when we consider the role of private sector, especially in those countries for adaptation financing.
Thanks, Rafael. Over to you, Rachna.
Thank you, Shiva. Thank you, Rafael. This is a very good discussion. So we have better insights with your probing questions, Shiva. Thank you so much. And thanks, Rafael. Before we open the floor, we have Philip Gonzalez here. So I'm just wondering if we could hear from him first before we could go into the open discussion. So Philip, are you around? I had already introduced you. Philip is the Regional Director of Forum of Federations, and Philip will give us a quick update on a quick regional update. So it would be good to hear from Philip. Philip, over to you.
Probably he has some network issues. He's been logging on and off.
Okay. All right. So then let's open the floor. We already have a question from Glenn. So maybe we can start from that, and if more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions, which is a small group of people here. So, but we can start with a question from Glenn. I'll read it out to you, Rafael. It says, could you give some idea of the size of these grants, and how do you assess the long-term impact of the projects to address climate changes? So over to you, Rafael.
Yeah, this is a very good question, because of course it will vary in each country, but Local is designed to be a top-up grant mechanism, which basically means that ideally it is not designed to cover the whole investment per se, but only the incremental cost. So based on that, we usually use the ratio of 10 to 20% on top of the regular capital grants, which those local governments are receiving. But of course, we know that especially in the LDC, some of these countries are not even, some of these local governments are not even receiving, capital grants for overall development. So if that's the case, Local can start as a standalone finance mechanism, but with the view that, as the decentralization systems mature in the country, it can be somehow aligned with this top-up kind of mechanism. But it can vary, as low as $15,000 to as perhaps big as 400,000 in some countries. But recently has been, like in Bangladesh, for instance, a redesign of the mechanism. Now we have average $50,000. So it will vary in each country, but it's usually meant to finance, the incremental cost. And these are not usually, big grants, because when you think about the needs at the local level, they are a bit different from, and so far, of course, and I need also to ponder this, because Local has been mostly used for non-city kind of environments. Of course, when we move to a sort of more urban environment, I think also the size would vary greatly, because, the type of adaptation investment that would be needed in a city are somehow different from what we would need like in a or secondary cities or local governments, in rural areas. So this is also to be taken into account. And in terms of your second question, how do you assess the long-term impact? This is a very tricky question, because as we know, it's really hard to measure progress on adaptation. And so far, and this has been also an observation from the global stocktake, there is little evidence of the actual adaptation outcomes of the funded investments. But we do use the system, the framework that I have mentioned, the ACAF, and we do expect that over time we can have somehow and of course, as we do this predictability of every year providing grants to the same local governments, over time we are able to somehow collect more evidence of the work that is being done. And so it's really like long term. And the metrics are there to really capture these, but of course, there is always like a mismatch between the funding cycle, where you have 1 year to deliver, and then the more longer term needs in terms of capturing the evidence that adaptation is really working. So for that, this ACAF guidance also gives us, or sets out that we should do some evaluations every 3 years to really understand, whether those adaptation investments are reaping adaptation results. We haven't undertaken so far, because we have started rolling out ACAF for the past 2.5 years. So we should be able to do that quite soon. So we really understand how this could feature and provide additional evidence of how these grants could provide adaptation results. And of course, this needs also to be aligned with the country level documents like the NDCs, the NAPs, etc. So I hope I have addressed more or less your question.
Thank you, Rafael. So any other questions? Please, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. All right, I am not. Okay, I do not see any other questions as such. So, Rafael, maybe I can ask you a question. I take an opportunity to ask these questions. We often talk about having performance-based indicators related to climate change in the in the system, in the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. Are there countries where these climate change indicators are incorporated in intergovernmental fiscal transfers? Do you have can you give us some examples of those countries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as part of these, performance-based climate resilience grant mechanism, as I said, we have these, two, let's say, cohorts of indicators, minimum conditions, which are more on the fiduciary standards. So let's say, no audit issues, a minimum, capacity to handle funds at the local level. So they are more on the fiduciary standard or PFM kind of indicators. On the other side, we capture all indicators around adaptation, on climate change issues. And this is also assessed every year as part of this annual performance assessment. And that becomes, because Local is also integrated as part of the existing intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. So it becomes, the idea is for Local to then become the key system to channel climate finance for local adaptation. And we have, at least 50% of those performance measures they have to do with climate-related indicators. And here we would have, for instance, the use of these climate risk assessments to be integrated in the local development plan. So if the identified adaptation investments are really responding to those identified climate risks, if communities have also been if they had a stake, in actually identify those adaptation investments which are being funded here. And this is really important, especially when we talk about locally led adaptation, because we cannot talk about local adaptation without making sure that those which are being affected are part of the negotiations or part of the discussions, right? So this is also something that is captured there. But of course, we also have other indicators such as the adaptation plans, if they are somehow aligned with the national adaptation plans or the NDCs and so on. So I mean, we do have these in all the in all the design documents of local in all these countries that I showed at 38, of course. And as they start implementation, that is to somehow encourage them towards improving performance around that. In the case, for instance, in Tuvalu, where we run 3 financial cycles already in terms of delivery of grants, we have seen out of this annual performance assessment an upward curve, which basically means that every year, and of course, I mean, you need to still to support them, right? We need to accompany them throughout the process, because if we just leave them, without support, I mean, yeah, that would be complicated, because, adaptation differently from, development, or usual development investment, they require specific skill sets that are new to most of local governments. At the same time, we need to make sure that it's not complicated. We need to simplify the process, because local governments, I mean, the capacity at the local level are already limited. So if you somehow, or if every partner comes here and start new screening tools here and there, so it becomes really messy for them. So we need to make sure that we make sure that it's as simple as possible. But at the same time, ensuring that they understand those risks, and we see this upward learning curve, which goes up every year. So which basically means that the more they implement those grants and the more they receive support every year, the better they get at planning for adaptation, in managing those adaptation investments, but also in monitoring, because we also assess how well they are monitoring those investments every year. So the more they tick those boxes in this annual performance assessment, the more or the higher will be the allocations for the subsequent year. Over.
Thank you so much for a comprehensive response, Rafael. Very helpful. I do not see any hands, so maybe in the interest of time, we can close this discussion for today. So thank you so much, Rafael. This is very useful. I'm very glad that you shared with us not only the COP28 insight, but also very important, this local. I'm always fascinated by the kind of work that you guys do under local. So. And also thanks to Shiva Ranjani from OPM, the Oxford Policy Management. It was very engaging and very nice discussion. So I would like to thank both of you for this very productive, very insightful discussions. So now I'd like to call upon Nick Travis to give us a quick update on Logica. So Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes. Yes.
Let me just try and. Okay, it doesn't seem to like it, so I'll just do a verbal update if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, thank you everybody, and good afternoon, and thanks for finding space on the agenda for me to provide this update. As many of you know, the LPSA, the Local Public Sector Alliance, part of its work is assessing the state of local governance institutions across various different regions of the world. And we are currently primarily focusing on 3 regions, the Asia region, the Sub-Saharan African region, and the Latin American region. And we've been making progress on each of these over the past months, in terms of conducting what we call intergovernmental profiles. So the LPSA has developed a methodology called the Logica framework, which some of you may have come across in previous meetings or perhaps have been involved in some of the country work as well. And the aim of the Logica framework is to provide, well, it provides a set of assessment tools for analysing the multi-level governance structure of a particular country. And what we've been focusing on to date is what we call the intergovernmental profile, which tries to establish a country's organizational governance structure and the nature of the entities that exist at the subnational level. So, of course, most countries will have some subnational governance structure of some sort, whether that's regional government, local government, lower local government, village government, urban specific governments, and so forth. And so the idea of the work is to map that out for a particular country in terms of the structure, and also trying to understand exactly the level of autonomy and authority that those entities enjoy. And you may ask why we are doing this. At the most basic level, we know that local governments are important for service delivery and socio-economic development. But what we found in this field is that there is actually no consensus definition of what a local government is precisely. And if you speak to political scientists and you speak to economists and you speak to public administration experts, you actually get very different perspectives on what local governments are from their discipline. And there's actually no global resource available to determine whether, local governments, genuine local governments, actually exist in a country. And perhaps most importantly, in this work, we're finding is that there's no sort of metric which evaluates the extent to which local governments are empowered in a particular country to respond to local needs of their constituents. Are they local governments with extensive devolved powers and responsibilities in many areas? Are they simply non-devolved entities? Are they deconcentrated entities? Or are they somewhere in between with some features of devolved responsibility, but with important elements of autonomy withheld and maintained at the central level? Where on the spectrum do institutions in a particular country lie? And so the methodology tries to establish, a way of analysing the nature of government institutions at the subnational level along this kind of spectrum, ranging from non-devolved entities that are simply units of high-level government, all the way through to devolved, fully devolved subnational governments with extensive autonomy. And so we've been, and there's a methodology in the form of a series of questions related to the political, administrative, and fiscal characteristics of subnational institutions in terms of their autonomy and authority in those dimensions, which help determine, the extent of autonomy and authority that they enjoy, and therefore which of the various categories of subnational governance institution they should be categorized as. And that methodology has been sort of refined over the past year, because as we were going through the various country level exercises, we found that perhaps it was a bit heavy, it was taking a bit too long to do the write-up. So we've simplified it a bit over the past couple of months and are now rolling out across the Asia region. We've actually just finished a series of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and a report is currently out for public comment. So that, if that's of interest in terms of an example of what the kind of results or analysis can show, then we would happily share that. And we're aiming to do the same in the Asia region over the coming months, to compare and contrast the nature of subnational institutions across the region. And we foresee that there are quite significant differences across countries, which is quite interesting. That being said, we've actually finished some of the countries already. So on the decentralization.net website, there's a country page, and you'll see that various countries in the Asia region have now been completed. I think Bangladesh, Indonesia, Timor-Leste are amongst them. And we've also initiated various countries, the various countries are in progress, mostly in South Asia, but also a couple in East and Southeast Asia, where we're just trying to finish those off, and they'll be uploaded to the website soon. So watch this space. A lot of profiles will hopefully be finalized and uploaded for comment and your viewing over the next couple of months, I think, which will be good. But there are also a variety of different countries, probably around 10 countries, where we need to initiate, particularly in the East Asia and Southeast Asia and Pacific region. And there are typically the way that we carry out these assessments is it's not really the secretariat at LPSA that leads them. We identify a national country expert in that country who is familiar with the subnational governance architecture to lead the assessments. And so pretty much, I think, almost without exception, all of the assessments so far have been led by a country expert with the secretariat providing inputs and quality assurance and so on. But that's the model that we try to adhere to, because obviously at the secretariat we are experts in relatively few countries. So there are a number of countries that we have yet to start, and we would like to perhaps not now, but after the meeting this week, perhaps reach out to some of you to help us identify country experts that would be willing to carry out the assessments for the countries that we've not yet started. And in some cases, we can offer an honorarium for those experts to do the work. In general, the methodology has been adapted to the extent where we hope that somebody with extensive knowledge of the country should be able to complete these assessments within sort of half a day. Because the amount of write-up is quite limited. It's all in the form of diagrams and so forth that's better for easy understanding and for better stakeholder consumption, if you like. So it's not a hugely complex exercise compared to what we were attempting earlier. So I guess that's kind of the next step for us, to move from sort of the current 10 countries that we're focusing on to try and encompass the whole region. And any assistance in helping us to identify some local experts in the various countries would be much appreciated. Lima and I will be in touch perhaps after the meeting with the specific countries that we're focusing on. And the ultimate objective is to try and wrap up assessments for the region by the middle of this year, and to produce a sort of a comparative analytical report on the state of local governance institutions for the whole region around probably in the summer, so June, July time. So that's the update. Happy to take any questions, and yeah, that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, very useful. And yes, I see that in the decentralization net that there are some good profiles, and it's very useful information actually. So our comparative analysis would be very useful. I mean, like ADB, we would like to see as, when we do projects and programs and operations, we'd like to see as to what are the areas we should be focusing on, and that information provides that basis as to, okay, this is the areas that the reform needs to focus on, and maybe this is already a strength, and this is the structure it is, and that really provides that context and foundation. So very useful documents. I'm sure that people will look into that and make use of that. Let's see if there are any questions. We can always unmute yourself and ask questions directly to Nick. Let's wait for a while.
Hi, Nick. I could go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Siva.
Sure.
Thanks, Nick. This is actually quite interesting, and please do share the link of the document or the framework that you mentioned is likely to soon be out for comments or review. and I believe this is from the Africa region, right?
Yeah,
The first
that's
one.
right.
Okay. My question, and it's less of a question, more of a musing around what you said, is that the first part where you said you realized while embarking on this exercise that there is no standard definition of what a local, what is the level at which government is adequately local and empowered enough, what really constitutes that, and that definition or a semblance of a definition does not always exist in all country contexts. I was wondering if you observed while building this framework or the tool, whether you observed differences in where that degree of empowerment or decision-making hub rests, depending on sector, or depending on the type of, the type of development action or governance action that needs to be taken, whether that actually made any sense, or if that is automatically captured in your framework, then probably this is taken care of. But I was wondering about that because in some countries, we know that the entry point to a certain sector level authority is not necessarily at the top. It actually rests somewhere in the middle. Or sometimes the top and the middle really wait for answers and questions to come from the bottom. So, thematically or sectorally, that difference does happen in reality. Of course, legislation is happening at the top, but then it may be just a question of the level of freedom, but also the level of relevance of a top level government vis-a-vis something that's closer to the grassroots. So does that feature anywhere?
Yeah, it does, and I think when we share the Africa report, you'll see quite a wide variety of experience across the countries that we looked at, and even in cases of course, we're focusing on the nature of these institutions. Now, it's quite possible that you can have fully empowered local governments using the methodology that we have, but they're still not particularly empowered in the form of functional responsibilities. So you may have, wonderful local governments that have no experience, no interference from the central government, but they're not responsible for health or education or social services that actually matter to people in their constituencies. So those are some of the things that are coming across. We do look at functions, but as part of the assessment, one of the things we found difficult was actually for country experts to actually work out using the standard classification of government functions what each level was responsible for, particularly in complex multi-tier countries such as India, Pakistan, and so forth, where many levels are involved in some way in certain functions, and trying to untangle specifically what level is responsible for which part of that sectoral function is very complex. And of course, there is in many countries, a very wide difference in the de jure versus the de facto situation. So what the law says each level should be doing versus what is actually done in practice, often which is very vague. So there's the functional side, which is complex. And in terms of the characteristics of what we look at, we've tried to take a multidisciplinary approach. So, for example, if you look at the IMF definition or sort of perspective on what a local government is, it focuses very much on the fiscal, legal, and administrative responsibilities that a local government has, but it ignores the political aspects. The IMF is apolitical in that respect, at least. So it doesn't, from the IMF perspective, it doesn't matter whether you have an unelected local government or an elected local government. Whereas if you ask a political scientist their perspective on that, they would have a very different response. For them, it would be, well, is there an elected local government, and do they have autonomy to carry out their own decisions, or is there interference? So, and then economists or budget people will look at, well, do they have their own budget? Do they pass their own budget? Does that budget have to be approved by the central government? Does that budget have to be in the national budget voted on by national parliament? And so there are all these different aspects and questions and characteristics that are widely different across countries. So what we tried to do in the method was to bring these different perspectives into a multidisciplinary way, And then for each of these dimensions, you know, the political, the administrative, and the fiscal, develop a series of questions that try to distinguish between these different levels of autonomy. So you might have a country that has its own budget, that approves its own budget, but ultimately is included in the national budget. So you would say for in that instance, well, clearly that the subnational institution has a degree of autonomy in determining how it spends its money, but it's not full autonomy if the national government can ultimately change it. Similarly, in the administrative aspects, if the chief executive of the local government authority or the institution is appointed by the higher level government, then you can't really say that it's a fully devolved, fully autonomous local government. Or if the organizational structure, the staffing structure of the local government is determined by the higher level government, doesn't really mean that it's fully autonomous. But if it appoints, say, it's some of its own officers, but not all of them, then they're somewhere in the middle. So we've tried to develop a series of questions that are able to, that allows the assessor to understand the extent of autonomy. And what we're finding, at least in the Africa region and for some of the countries that we looked at in the Asia region, that you have these entities that are called, you know, local governments, but really they're a sort of hybrid between a local government and a deconcentrated unit, because although they may be a fully recognized legal entity with certain powers, their autonomy is often restricted in important ways that sort of reduce the ability of them to operate as a fully autonomous government. So that's what we're trying to do. And it can be complicated, but we've tried to specify the questions in a way that should be able to be answered in a factual way. And there are complications in terms of asymmetries across the different levels of government and so forth. But we hope that this revised methodology provides some way of analysing the issue rather than sort of continuing with multiple definitions and so forth. Yeah. I hope that sort of answered your question. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks. Definitely it did. And look forward to the Africa region report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this brings us to the end of this program. I don't think there are any other questions. Okay. So we now have any other business, and I would like just to remind that we have decentralization.net website, which has lots of very good information and resources. Lima has already posted some of the link to the Profile and Logica framework. So let's get the most out of it. And we'll have the announcement in the website again for the next Asia working group meeting. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating today. So with this, we can close today's meeting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.